Hey everyone, I hope you're doing okay today, and thank you for taking a moment to be here with me. I want to talk about something that has been filling my inbox, my comments, and my messages nonstop lately, and that's the ongoing discussion around the Trump administration, potential payments, and these so-called stimulus or tariff dividend checks. This topic matters more than a lot of politicians and headlines are willing to admit, because for millions of households right now, extra money isn't about luxury or comfort. It's about stability. It's about whether the bills get paid on time, whether groceries stretch to the end of the month, and whether people can finally breathe without that constant knot of anxiety sitting in their chest. And what makes this situation especially different is where the money is supposedly coming from. Because unlike past stimulus programs that relied on emergency spending or increased borrowing, this idea is being tied to tariff revenue. That's unusual, it's controversial, and it's confusing, which is exactly why we need to slow this down and talk through it carefully, without hype and without fear-mongering, so you can set realistic expectations and protect your peace of mind. Let's start with what's actually being discussed, because there has been a lot of noise, half-truths, and straight-up misinformation floating around. President Trump has publicly floated the idea of sending $2,000 payments to Americans, often described as tariff dividend checks. The basic concept is that revenue collected from tariffs, especially on imported goods, could be redistributed back to the public in the form of direct payments. When people first hear that, the reaction is almost always the same. Are we actually getting checks? And if so, when? That question makes total sense, especially given the last few years where stimulus checks became a lifeline for so many families. But here's where things slow down, and I know this part is frustrating. Talking about payments is not the same thing as approving payments. Even though the president has mentioned these checks publicly and even hinted at timelines like mid-2026, that does not mean the checks are guaranteed, scheduled, or funded. It simply means the idea is being discussed at a high level. This is where understanding how government actually works becomes critical, even if it's not the most exciting topic. The White House can propose payments, promote them, and talk about them in speeches and interviews. But Congress controls the purse strings. Without congressional approval, no money goes out the door. And that approval is never automatic. Kevin Hassett, the director of the National Economic Council, addressed this directly in a national interview and made it very clear that Congress would have to approve and send the money. There is no automatic process, no executive shortcut, and no hidden fund waiting to be distributed. Even if the administration strongly supports the idea, lawmakers still have to agree, and that's where things get complicated. To understand why the administration believes this idea is even possible, we need to look at the economic argument they're making. Officials point to strong economic growth numbers, with multiple quarters showing growth close to 4%. They also highlight that the federal deficit has come down significantly compared to last year, and in some short periods the government even ran a surplus. That's something we haven't seen consistently in a long time, so from their perspective, this creates an opportunity. The logic goes like this. If the economy is growing, inflation is easing, and tariff revenue is coming in steadily, then maybe there's room to give some of that money back to the public. On paper, that argument can sound reasonable, especially if you're someone who's been squeezed by higher prices, rising rent, and increased costs for everyday essentials. But here's the part that rarely makes the headlines. Not everyone agrees with that math. Many economists are pushing back hard, not because they oppose helping people, but because they question whether the numbers actually add up. Estimates suggest that sending $2,000 to most adults in the country could cost close to $300 billion. Tariff revenue, even in a very strong year, is nowhere near that amount. So the obvious question becomes, where does the rest of the money come from? That gap is what makes lawmakers nervous, especially those who are already concerned about the national debt, which is now hovering around $37 trillion. For many in Congress, adding a new benefit without clearly identifying how it's fully funded is a non-starter. Another layer to this conversation is how tariffs actually work in real life, because this is often misunderstood. Tariffs are technically paid by importers, but those costs don't just disappear. They usually get passed down the line to consumers through higher prices. That means when you buy clothing, appliances, electronics, or even certain food products, you may already be paying more because of tariffs. In that sense, a tariff dividend check could feel like getting some of your own money back. However, economists warn that sending out large payments could also lead to a surge in consumer spending, which might push inflation back up. Inflation has cooled compared to a couple of years ago, but it's still a sensitive issue, and no one wants to see prices start climbing again. Kevin Hassett has argued that inflation has come down to around 1.6% on a recent 3-month average, which is below the Federal Reserve's target. That's encouraging news if it holds, but critics point out that inflation isn't gone. It's just quieter for now. Policies that inject a lot of cash into the economy all at once could reignite price pressures, especially if supply chains or labor markets can't keep up with increased demand. And speaking of labor markets, that's another major piece of this puzzle. You may have heard people talk about a hiring slowdown or even a hiring recession. The administration disagrees with that framing and points to job creation numbers, particularly among native-born workers. They connect this trend to tighter immigration policies, arguing that fewer undocumented workers create more opportunities for people already here. However, businesses in industries like construction, agriculture, and manufacturing have raised concerns about worker shortages. When businesses can't find enough workers, projects get delayed, costs rise, and those higher costs often get passed on to consumers. Once again, you see how everything connects. Payments, tariffs, jobs, prices, and inflation are all part of the same system, and changing one piece affects all the others. Let me pause here for a moment and speak directly to you because this is important. When you hear about stimulus checks or proposed payments like this, what's your first reaction? Is it relief, hope, skepticism, frustration, or confusion? For most people, it's probably a mix of all of those emotions at once. And there's no wrong answer. The uncertainty itself is exhausting, especially when you're already stretched thin. Hearing from each other and sharing perspectives helps cut through the noise and reminds us that we're not navigating this alone. So where does this leave us right now? As of today, there are no approved stimulus checks tied to tariffs. There is no signed law, no official payment schedule, and no guarantee that this will happen. What we have is a proposal, some public statements, and a lot of debate. The administration may bring a formal plan to Congress in the future, but whether it passes depends on negotiations, political priorities, and broader concerns about spending and debt. Even within Congress, there is significant disagreement. Some lawmakers support the idea of direct payments but insist that spending cuts must accompany any new benefit. Others oppose the concept altogether, arguing that the money could be better used elsewhere, or that it risks reigniting inflation. If you're wondering whether you should plan on this money, my honest advice is to treat it as a possibility, not a promise. If it happens, it could provide meaningful relief. It could help cover overdue bills, pay down high-interest debt, or build a small emergency fund. But relying on it before it's approved could set you up for disappointment. History has shown us that announcements often come before details. Details come before action, and sometimes action never comes at all. Staying grounded and cautious isn't pessimistic, it's practical. Financial stress is real, and I want to acknowledge that directly. I read comments every day from people who are worn down, tired of waiting, tired of prices going up, and tired of feeling like help is always just out of reach. If that's you, please know you're not alone. Even when economic headlines sound optimistic, lived reality can feel very different. Growth numbers and averages don't always reflect what's happening at the kitchen table. Here's something that might surprise you. Even if these checks never happen, the conversation around them still matters. It tells us how leaders are thinking about economic relief and what tools they're willing to consider. Using tariffs as a funding source is not traditional, and whether you agree with it or not, it signals a shift in how economic policy is being framed. That's important to pay attention to because it shapes future decisions and priorities. Timing is another critical factor. Even under the most optimistic scenario, these payments would not happen quickly. There would need to be a formal proposal, committee hearings, debates, votes, and implementation. That process takes time, often months or even years. If you see headlines suggesting immediate payments, take a breath and look for confirmation from reliable sources. And please be cautious about scams. Whenever payments are discussed, bad actors take advantage of the confusion. No legitimate program will ask you for upfront fees, personal information through unsolicited texts, or payment to release funds. If something feels off, it probably is. As we continue to watch how this unfolds, my goal is to keep sharing clear, grounded updates. I want to explain what's real, what's proposed, and what's just talk without sensationalism. You deserve accurate information so you can make informed decisions and protect yourself from unnecessary stress. This conversation doesn't require blind optimism or constant outrage. It requires patience, awareness, and a focus on what you can control: your budget, your spending, your savings, and your mental well-being. If this topic matters to you, I encourage you to stay engaged, share your thoughts, and be part of the discussion. You don't have to agree with everything, and you don't have to have all the answers. Just being informed and connected helps more than you might realize. Take care of yourself, look out for one another, and remember that clarity is always more powerful than hype. I'll continue to keep you updated as things develop, and I'll see you next time.